When ancient people spoke about the gods, they weren't talking about distant myths or abstract beliefs. They meant something immediate, forces that moved through daily life, shaping emotions, decisions, even destiny. Yet to modern ears, this language feels strange, almost impossible to take literally. So we quietly translate it. Where they saw gods, we see psychology, impulses, instincts, unconscious drives. But what if that translation hides something important about how ancient people actually experienced the world? If we look at the old stories with modern eyes, it is tempting to treat the gods as nothing more than colorful inventions. Characters created by ancient people to explain thunder, love, or war. But that view misses something subtle that those cultures understood instinctively. The gods were not only beings and stories, they were ways of describing powerful patterns that move through human life. Forces that appear again and again in the mind, in society, and in history. When ancient people spoke of a god, they were often pointing toward an experience that felt larger than any single person. Think about the figure of Venus. In mythology, she is the goddess of love and beauty, the radiant presence that draws hearts together. But Venus can also be understood as something more immediate and psychological. The surge of attraction when someone enters a room. The sudden pull toward beauty, toward intimacy, toward possession. The way attention narrows and the world rearranges itself around the object of desire. In those moments, love or lust does not feel like a quiet personal preference. It feels like a current moving through us. Anyone who has fallen deeply in love knows this sensation. Thoughts circle constantly around the beloved. Plans change. Priorities shift. The mind begins to interpret every detail through the lens of attraction. What once seemed ordinary becomes charged with meaning. The beloved face appears everywhere in memory and imagination. It is as if perception itself has been subtly reconfigured. The ancient world might have said Venus had arrived, and that language captures something real about the experience. Because when such a force takes hold, it does not behave like a simple decision of the rational mind. People often find themselves acting in ways they did not plan. They pursue someone despite knowing the complications. They idealize beauty even when they understand the illusion. Desire persuades the mind, bends judgment, and colors perception. It can feel as if something larger than the individual has stepped forward and is steering the ship. In this sense, the old gods can be understood as transpersonal motivational forces. They are patterns of emotion and impulse that live within human beings, but are not controlled by them. They move across individuals and generations, shaping behavior again and again. When people personified these forces as gods, they were giving a face and a name to something that already felt alive in experience. The mythology was not only fantasy, it was a language for describing the immense currents inside the human psyche. Mars offers another clear example. In the old stories, he is the god of war, armored and restless, drawn toward conflict. But the energy behind Mars is familiar to anyone who has felt the surge of anger or the thrill of confrontation. It is the impulse that sharpens attention, tightens the body, and pushes a person toward battle. Not always literal battle, of course, but competition, dominance, defense, the urge to strike back. When this force awakens, the world begins to look different. Obstacles become enemies. Disagreements feel like challenges. The body fills with heat and urgency. And just like the force of Venus, the energy of Mars can feel strangely impersonal. People sometimes act in anger before they fully understand what they are doing. A harsh word is spoken. A fight erupts. Later, the person may wonder why the reaction was so intense. It can feel as though the moment was seized by something beyond conscious control. Ancient cultures expressed that sensation by saying that Mars had taken hold. Seen this way, the old gods were not merely imaginary figures drifting through myth. They were attempts to describe the deep motivational forces that shape human perception and action. Love, lust, beauty, jealousy, conflict, ambition. These energies move through individuals, yet they also transcend them. They shape the stories of relationships, the rise and fall of nations, the decisions people make even when they believe they are acting freely. The language of gods gave form to the mysterious feeling that sometimes we are not simply choosing our path. Sometimes we are being carried by something far older and far larger than ourselves. Over time, the language we use to describe these experiences changed. The ancient world spoke openly about gods moving through the landscape of human life. Desire arrived as Venus. Rage stirred as Mars. The forces that shaped behavior were imagined as powers that approached us, touched us, and sometimes overtook us. But as centuries passed and the modern scientific worldview began to form, people grew less comfortable describing human behavior in that way. Gradually, the gods retreated. In their place came new explanations, new vocabularies, and new frameworks for understanding why people act as they do. One of the most influential of these was behaviorism, a way of studying human actions by focusing only on what could be observed from the outside. In this view, the inner world of motives, feelings, and impulses was set aside as something vague and unreliable. Instead, behaviorists spoke about stimuli and responses. Something happens in the environment, and the organism reacts. On the surface, this language sounds clean and precise. A stimulus occurs, a response follows. Cause and effect. But if we look closely at the idea of a stimulus, something slightly strange begins to appear. Imagine a child who has just been scolded for shouting at a friend. The child crosses their arms and protests. "I didn't do it for no reason. He made me angry." The statement sounds childish, yet it carries an ancient intuition. The child is saying that the force of anger came from outside. Something happened that pushed the feeling into existence. Modern adults tend to correct this quickly. We explain that no one can make you angry. The anger is inside you. The other person only triggered it. The impulse, we say, belongs to the individual. And so the world is divided into two neat categories. Out there are objects, events, and stimuli. In here are emotions, impulses, and motivations. The environment acts, the mind reacts, but everyday experience rarely feels so tidy. Think again about attraction. Someone walks into a room and suddenly attention shifts. Beauty seems to glow around them. The body reacts before any deliberate thought appears. A quickening of the pulse, a sharpened curiosity, a subtle gravitational pull of awareness. It does not feel like a calculated decision. It feels as though something in the world has reached out and caught hold of perception. In moments like that, the boundary between object and impulse becomes blurred. Is the beauty in the person or in the perceiving mind? Is the attraction something we produced internally, or something that the presence of the other somehow awakened? Ancient people answered this question differently than we do. They experienced motive force as something woven into the world itself. The sight of beauty carried the presence of Venus. Conflict carried the heat of Mars. The forces that stirred human emotion were not sealed away inside the individual mind. They moved through the environment, through relationships, through situations. Modern culture, by contrast, has steadily pushed those forces inward. What once appeared as gods in the world now appear as drives in the psyche. Desire becomes libido. Aggression becomes instinct. Attraction becomes a chemical reaction or a cognitive bias. The language shifts, but the experience underneath remains strangely familiar. We still feel overtaken by love. We still feel swept up by anger. We still encounter beauty in a way that rearranges perception before we can explain it. The difference is that our explanations now insist the source lies entirely within us. In a quiet way, the gods did not disappear. They simply moved. What ancient cultures once saw walking through the world around them has been relocated into the hidden chambers of the human mind. Beneath these shifting explanations lies something even more fundamental. However we choose to describe them, gods, instincts, drives, or psychological forces, human behavior is constantly shaped by deep biological motivations that operate far below the surface of conscious thought. At the broadest level, life organizes itself around two immense imperatives: the drive to preserve the self and the drive to propagate the species. Self-preservation is the force that keeps a living being alive. It pushes organisms to seek food, avoid danger, maintain body temperature, and defend their boundaries. Without it, survival would be impossible. Self-propagation is the complementary impulse. It draws individuals toward reproduction, toward partnership, toward the continuation of life beyond the limits of a single body. These two drives form a kind of deep architecture beneath human behavior. Almost everything we do can be traced in some way to one of them. But these drives rarely appear in their pure form. Instead, they express themselves through countless smaller signals and motivations that guide behavior moment by moment. Hunger is one of them. Thirst is another. The discomfort of cold air against the skin or the relief of warmth in sunlight. Each of these sensations nudges the body in particular directions, quietly steering action long before conscious reasoning enters the scene. The same pattern appears in the domain of attraction. The experience of beauty, for example, feels immediate and mysterious, yet much of it is shaped by ancient sensory systems that evolved long before human culture existed. When people describe someone as attractive, they often speak in vague or poetic terms. But beneath that language are subtle biological cues being processed with extraordinary speed. Scent plays a role that most people barely notice. Human beings possess a sensitive chemical awareness of one another that operates almost entirely below conscious recognition. Subtle differences in body odor can signal information about immune system compatibility and genetic diversity. Studies suggest that people often find the natural scent of individuals with complementary immune genes particularly appealing. Without realizing it, the nose may be quietly evaluating the biological advantages of a potential partner. Vision carries its own ancient signals. Symmetry in the human face and body is frequently perceived as beautiful, and this preference appears across cultures. One reason may be that symmetry often reflects developmental stability. A body that grew evenly may signal health, resilience, and freedom from serious environmental stress during development. To the conscious mind, symmetry simply looks pleasing. But to deeper perceptual systems, it may function as a quick visual shorthand for biological fitness. Other cues are even more subtle. Features associated with fertility, certain body proportions, skin tone, posture, movement, can quietly influence attraction without the observer ever forming a clear thought about them. At the same time, mechanisms that detect genetic distance may help guide social and romantic boundaries. Humans tend to feel instinctive discomfort or indifference toward individuals who are too genetically similar, a subtle safeguard against inbreeding that operates largely outside awareness. What is striking about all of these processes is how little conscious control they involve. The mind may later construct explanations, "I like their smile," or "there is something about their energy." But by the time those explanations appear, many of the underlying decisions have already been made by sensory and emotional systems that evolved over millions of years. In this sense, desire often begins as a quiet conversation between ancient parts of the brain and signals arriving from the world. The body evaluates warmth, scent, movement, sound, posture, and countless other details before the conscious mind has even finished registering what it sees. What we experience as a feeling of attraction or aversion is the final surface ripple of a much deeper process unfolding beneath awareness. The same is true beyond attraction. The sudden urge to eat, the recoil from a foul smell, the comfort of warmth, the unease of unfamiliar territory. These reactions arise from sensory networks designed to keep the organism alive and capable of reproducing. They are fast, automatic, and deeply persuasive. And because they evolved long before reflective thought, they do not always ask permission from the conscious mind. They simply appear carrying their own urgency. A craving emerges. A feeling of disgust flares up. A fascination takes hold. Only afterward does the rational mind attempt to explain or justify what has already begun. This is why the language of inner drives and emotional forces continues to feel strangely alive even in a scientific age. Beneath the surface of deliberate choice, powerful systems are constantly shaping perception and behavior. They guide attention, color, emotion, and nudge the body toward particular actions. And when these deeper systems gather enough intensity, they can overwhelm the careful plans of the thinking mind. In those moments, it becomes clear that human consciousness is not always the captain of the ship. Sometimes it is only the narrator trying to make sense of powerful currents that began moving long before awareness caught up with them. All of this becomes especially visible when people encounter something they cannot understand. Most of the time, daily life unfolds inside familiar patterns. We know what objects are, what situations mean, how events are likely to unfold. Because of that familiarity, the deeper systems guiding our behavior remain mostly organized and restrained. Hunger appears when it is appropriate. Anger flares in proportion to a threat. Attraction emerges in particular contexts. Conscious thought seems to sit comfortably at the center, interpreting events and making decisions. But when the mind confronts something unknown, something it cannot quickly categorize, that quiet order begins to loosen. In those moments, the systems that normally operate in careful balance can become broadly disinhibited all at once. Instead of a single clear response, many emotional and motivational circuits activate together. Fear rises quickly, because the unknown might contain danger. Curiosity awakens, because something new has appeared. The body prepares to run, to fight, to investigate, sometimes all at the same time. The result is a strange mixture of impulses that do not feel entirely voluntary. The heart speeds up, muscles tense, attention sharpens in sudden bursts. Thoughts race to construct explanations. Behavior may become awkward or exaggerated laughter that arrives too loudly, anger that feels out of proportion, a sudden urge to withdraw or confront. Modern language often compresses this entire experience into a single vague word: stress. But that word hides more than it reveals. Saying someone is stressed suggests a general pressure, a kind of background strain. What it often overlooks is the more complex reality underneath multiple ancient systems activating together, each trying to steer behavior in its own direction. Fear urges caution. Aggression prepares the body for defense. Curiosity pushes attention forward. The need for social reassurance searches for allies. The mind begins assembling interpretations, sometimes wildly, in an effort to restore a sense of order. When all of this unfolds at once, the illusion of calm, conscious control begins to slip. It becomes clear that many forces inside the mind operate automatically, responding to uncertainty, long before deliberate thought has a chance to organize them. And it is precisely in these moments, when the unknown strips away our sense of mastery, that the ancient ways of speaking start to feel strangely reasonable again. Because when powerful emotions surge together without clear explanation, it can feel less like a simple mental process and more like something arriving from outside, as if unseen forces have suddenly stepped into the situation, stirring the body and mind in ways that cannot easily be commanded. Long before psychology developed its modern vocabulary, people recognized this experience. They did not call it stress. They described it as the presence of powers moving through the world, touching human lives in ways that could not always be predicted or controlled. Among the many stories ancient cultures told about the forces shaping human life, few are as powerful or enduring as the Egyptian myth of Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Horus. It is not simply a tale of gods. It is a story about order, betrayal, destruction, and the fragile process of renewal. In the beginning of the story, Osiris stands as the great founding king. He is remembered as the ruler who brought civilization to the land. Under his guidance, the wildness of the world was gradually shaped into something stable and fertile. Agriculture flourished along the Nile. Laws emerged. Communities learned how to live together under shared rules. Osiris represents the force of order, the patient effort to turn chaos into something livable. But even the strongest order carries within it a hidden vulnerability. As time passes, Osiris grows older. His reign, once vibrant and creative, becomes more established, more settled. The structures he created remain, but the energy that built them begins to fade. The king who once transformed the world becomes a guardian of what already exists. And in the shadow of that aging order stands Seth. Seth is Osiris's brother, but he embodies a very different force. Where Osiris builds, Seth disrupts. Where Osiris stabilizes, Seth tears apart. In the Egyptian imagination, Seth represents chaos, envy, violence, and the destructive impulses that always lurk beside human achievement. The story tells how Seth grows resentful of his brother's power. Order, prosperity, and harmony gather around Osiris while Seth stands outside them. Eventually, resentment hardens into a plan. One night, Seth invites Osiris to a grand feast. The gathering is filled with laughter and music, and in the center of the room, Seth presents a beautifully crafted chest. It is ornate, perfectly shaped, and he announces a game: whoever fits inside the chest exactly will be allowed to keep it. One by one, the guests try, but none of them fit. When Osiris steps forward and lies down inside the chest, closes around him with uncanny precision. In that instant, the celebration becomes a trap. Seth slams the lid shut. The chest is sealed, nailed closed, and carried away. Osiris, the great king who once brought order to the world, is murdered by his own brother and cast into the river. But Seth's violence does not stop there. When the body of Osiris is later recovered, Seth attacks again, this time dismembering his brother into pieces and scattering them across the land. It is an act of deliberate desecration, a symbol of how chaos does not simply defeat order, it attempts to tear it apart so completely that it can never return. For a time, it seems as if Seth has succeeded. The king is gone. The body of order lies broken and scattered. The land is left without its guiding force. But the story does not end in destruction. Osiris's wife Isis begins a long and patient search. She travels across the land gathering the scattered pieces of her fallen husband. Piece by piece, fragment by fragment, she restores what can be restored. It is an act of devotion, but also an act of reconstruction. Where chaos tried to scatter and destroy, Isis works to gather and remember. Through her efforts, Osiris is not fully returned to the living world, but something new becomes possible. Before he passes into the realm of the dead, Isis conceives a child with him. That child is Horus. Horus does not grow up in a palace. He grows up hidden, protected from the eyes of Seth, who still rules through force and fear. In secret, the child matures. He learns. He prepares. Horus represents something different from the old order his father once embodied. Osiris founded the original kingdom, but Horus is born from its collapse. He is the next generation shaped by the memory of destruction. Where Osiris created order, Horus must defend it. Eventually, the hidden child becomes a warrior. When Horus returns, he does not simply reclaim the throne peacefully. He confronts Seth in a long and bitter struggle. The battles between them are fierce and costly. In many versions of the myth, both figures are wounded in the conflict. Horus loses an eye. Seth is injured as well. Victory does not arrive cleanly. This is one of the deepest truths embedded in the story. Evil does not vanish easily. Chaos does not simply disappear once defeated. The confrontation with corruption carries a cost even for the one who fights on the side of renewal. Yet the struggle matters. Through Horus, order is restored not as the exact same kingdom that Osiris once ruled, but as a renewed form of stability born from suffering and memory. The world that emerges afterward carries the scars of what happened. The past cannot be erased. But something living continues. The Egyptians told this story for thousands of years because it captured a pattern they recognized everywhere in life. Order rises, becomes stable, grows old, and eventually becomes vulnerable. Chaos challenges it, sometimes violently. Collapse follows. But within that collapse, the seeds of renewal begin to form. The scattered pieces are gathered. A new generation grows in the shadow of loss. And when the time comes, that generation must face the forces of destruction, again knowing that the struggle will never be simple and never entirely final. The story might seem as though it has already reached its natural conclusion. Horus has confronted Seth. The destructive force that shattered the kingdom has been challenged, and the young god now stands in position to claim the throne that once belonged to his father. In many myths, this is where the tale would end, the hero victorious, the crown restored, the future secured. But the Egyptian story takes a quieter and more surprising turn. During his long struggle with Seth, Horus is wounded. In one of their fierce confrontations, he loses an eye. Later, that eye is restored. The recovered eye becomes one of the most famous symbols in Egyptian culture, the Eye of Horus, representing vision, healing, and wholeness regained after damage. What Horus does with that restored eye is the true turning point of the myth. Instead of simply keeping the throne and moving forward as the new ruler of the living world, Horus descends into the underworld where Osiris now reigns among the dead. There, in the shadowed realm beneath the surface of life, the son offers the recovered eye to his father. It is a quiet gesture, but its meaning is immense. The eye represents more than physical sight. It symbolizes awareness, perception, and the power to see clearly. By giving it to Osiris, Horus restores vision to the old king who had been torn apart and cast into darkness. In doing so, he acknowledges something essential: the future cannot stand on its own. It must remain connected to the wisdom that came before. This act transforms the structure of power itself. Horus does not simply replace Osiris. Instead, the two figures become joined in a strange and powerful partnership. Osiris remains the ruler of the underworld, the realm of the past memory and judgment. Horus becomes the ruler of the living world, the domain of action, renewal, and change. One governs what has already happened. The other governs what is still unfolding. In the Egyptian imagination, real sovereignty emerges only when these two dimensions are held together. Courage, strength, and youthful energy are necessary for confronting chaos and defending order. But without the guidance of memory and accumulated wisdom, that energy can easily become reckless or blind. The myth suggests that legitimate authority requires both. This idea shaped the Egyptian understanding of kingship. The pharaoh was not seen as merely an individual person who happened to hold political power. The pharaoh was understood as an embodiment of a role that connected past and present. Each living ruler was identified with Horus, the youthful god who acts in the world. At the same time, the dead pharaoh became Osiris, the wise ruler of the underworld. In this way, the throne itself carried a kind of continuity that stretched across generations. The living king governed the land, but he stood within a long lineage of rulers whose authority did not disappear with death. The past remained present, watching, judging, and guiding. The result was a vision of sovereignty that was both personal and impersonal at the same time. A particular human being wore the crown, made decisions, and led the nation. Yet that individual was also stepping into a role shaped by centuries of tradition and memory. The king was both a man and a symbol, both a living actor and a continuation of something older than himself. In the mythic language of Egypt, Horus and Osiris were never completely separated. The son carried forward the life of the kingdom, but he did so in constant relationship with the father who ruled beneath the earth. True authority, the story suggests, is not simply seized in battle. It is established by joining courage with remembrance, action with reflection, the living present with the accumulated wisdom of the past. In Egypt, the union of Horus and Osiris did not remain only a mythic story. It became the symbolic foundation of the entire civilization. The Egyptians used the word ma'at to describe the principle that held the world together: order, truth, balance, the proper alignment between heaven, earth, and human society. Ma'at was not just a moral rule. It was the fragile structure that prevented the world from collapsing back into chaos. The pharaoh stood at the center of that structure. As the living Horus, he ruled the land, defended it, and acted within the shifting world of action and conflict. But when he died, he became Osiris, joining the lineage of rulers who watched from the realm beyond life. In that sense, the king was never just a person. He was the living expression of an enduring office that bridged past and present. The pyramids themselves reflected this belief. They were not simply tombs. They were monuments to the conviction that the spirit of the ruler endured, that the authority of the past continued to guide the living world. Kingship, memory, and cosmic order were woven together. Over time, however, something remarkable happened. The idea that the divine spark of sovereignty belonged only to the king began to spread outward. First, it extended to the aristocracy, who also came to believe that their spirits carried a measure of this enduring significance. Eventually, that belief moved even further, reaching ordinary people. The notion quietly emerged that every individual possessed something within them that could not be reduced to mere matter or momentary power. Each person carried a kind of inner sovereignty and intrinsic worth that deserved recognition. In the distant background of this idea lies something biological as well. Social animals, including human beings, organize themselves through hierarchies. But stable hierarchies require restraint. Dominance cannot become pure tyranny without destroying the group itself. Signals of status recognition and dignity evolve because cooperation depends on them. Human cultures gradually transformed these biological patterns into moral principles. The respect once reserved for kings became, over centuries, the foundation for concepts like individual dignity, natural rights, and the belief that legitimate authority must answer to the people. Yet the roots of those beliefs run deep into myth biology and history. They are not simple ideas that can be discarded without consequence. They rest on thousands of years of reflection about order, power, and the fragile balance that allows societies to endure. When we speak today about rights, dignity, and the value of a single human life, it can feel like these ideas appeared recently, products of modern reason. But their roots stretch far deeper through myth memory and the long struggle to understand power and order. If you enjoy exploring these hidden foundations of human thought, consider subscribing and following along. There is always more beneath the surface than it first appears.